Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Barbara Mullan, a health psychologist at Curtin University who is studying the cognitive aspects that drive human decision making. Her focus is on how we make decisions on the food we eat, our health, and what is needed for individual and societal change. Why is it that knowing something is not good for us is frequently insufficient for people to change their behaviour?
Often we want a different outcome, but we don't actually want to change. So sometimes we're not actually motivated. Even if people are able to change, it can either be just too hard, they don't have the skills or the knowledge to change.
How conscious are we of our decisions?
One of the things that we work a lot with in my research group is around habits. We do an awful lot of stuff without even thinking.
Government influence is limited.
Policy does work, but you have to have a populace who's willing to accept it. And there are certain countries that just are not willing to have those policies brought in. So that becomes a real tension then.
Behavioural change is a negotiation.
We have to remember that, if you take something like smoking or eating chocolate away from people, we do have to give them something in between, because often that's the only thing keeping us from banging our head against the wall.
The influence of socio-economic status is significant.
Individuals can change their behaviour even when societies don't, so people can make those choices. But it's often our more vulnerable people who are less likely to change.
The cultural impact of our food decisions cannot be ignored.
No matter what culture, it's a part of our celebrations, it's part of everything we do has some sort of element of food or drink, and often our sad occasions, so funerals and so on, often again related to food. So it's how we bring people together.
We can't avoid geopolitics.
On top of all the sustainability stuff, we've got a cost of living crisis in a lot of countries at the moment. So, because of various wars and so on and various other things that are happening globally, there's a lot of countries and a lot of people who were doing okay 12 months ago, really struggling now.
We all need to prioritise.
Yes, individuals can make a difference. Yes, we should all be trying to do this stuff. But if I was seeing somebody who was, really worried about this, I would say choose, keeping your family healthy and fed over saving the planet, and we'll worry about the planet tomorrow.
All people are blinkered when it comes to our food choices.
We did a study a couple of years ago. This is one of my favorite anecdotes. And we took photos of what people were eating. People took photos of what they were eating and sent them to us. And then we had conversations in focus groups with people to say, what do you think of this meal? Do you think it's healthy, not healthy? What would you change about it? And so on. And one was a Sunday roast with meat and veg and roast potatoes and so on, and 8 bottles of beer, empty. And people were asked, what would you change about this? Not one person said reduce the alcohol consumption.
We need to learn to be kind to ourselves.
People, when they're trying to change their health behaviours, are violently cruel to themselves. They talk to themselves the way you would never talk to your friends.
Barbara, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Change. Frequently we know what we need to do, but we have a lot of trouble actually doing that, both at an individual level and at a societal level. So can you dig into that a little, please?
Yes, certainly. So, the first point I think is often we want a different outcome, but we don't actually want to change. So sometimes we're not actually motivated. So, someone who wants to cut back on eating snacks or drinking wine might know that they should change it, but don't actually want to give up the behavior. So, and that could be the same for speeding or, any of our human behaviors. We often know that we shouldn't do them, but actually there's a lot of hedonic pleasure in the things that are generally bad for us, or the things we enjoy more. So that's a starting point. So knowing something is maybe not the healthiest habit doesn't necessarily mean that we want to change. So that's one of the places we often start, is with people's motivation. The second thing I think is, even if people are able to change, it can either be just too hard, they don't have the skills or the knowledge to change. So somebody who has a very poor diet might want to change, but actually don't know how to cook or don't really know what to do with certain ingredients. So it's much easier then to stick with takeaway, takeout, drive-through, and so on. But secondly, I think on that, one of the things that we work a lot with in my research group is around habits. We do an awful lot of stuff without even thinking. So, and that's brilliant from an evolutionary perspective. The less we have to think, the easier our lives is. We make millions of decisions constantly. What are we going to have for breakfast? How are we going to get to work? Decisions at work, then you come home and you have to decide all over again what's for tea, what time do you go to bed, all of these sorts of things. So the more of that we can make habitual, the better. But often those are bad habits, not good habits. So good habits can be great. Bad habits can be very, very hard to change because they're what we default back to when we're tired or stressed. So that's the eating a packet of lollies, or what we're in America now, candy, while watching Netflix or, you know, whatever it might be. And suddenly the whole packet is gone and you haven't even realized you're doing it.
You mentioned the motivation, and I guess what that got me thinking about was senses of urgency. So, okay, we know whatever those habits are, whether it's eating too much takeaway food or too many lollies or smoking cigarettes, that they're bad for us. There's no doubt about that. We then, you know, when you're in your 20s and you're maybe particularly active, and it's you know, you don't notice the benefit, the downside of it. So you do create those habits. But then there's a time when there is urgency. That person who was fit and healthy is no longer able to, you know, easily walk upstairs or all those sorts of things. And frequently, even when that urgency seems there doesn't seem to be or response to that urgency, or even if it's seen in the far distant future, it seems to be ignored. So it's kind of that short-term versus long-term decision making. What have you seen in that space?
Yes, so some of that actually comes down to personality. So some people are much better at thinking about future consequences. So there are people who are more likely to, if they're thinking about eating or changing their diet, they can think about the consequences. So it can be personality, but it's also something we use. So if you can get people to think about the consequences. So one of the things when, as you said, people get older, often getting them to think about, well, if you don't change your diet, if you don't lose weight, what does that mean for spending time with your children or your grandchildren? So that can be a really powerful motivator. So it's about finding the things in the future that matter. For a lot of people, it's not just living till they're 110, or it's about that quality of life rather than the quantity. So, you know, it can be as simple as people get older, they have to sit down to put their socks on. So, you know, getting people to do more physical activity can just help with some of those smaller things. So if you can get people to focus on the long term, on the consequences of not acting, that can help people to actually make those changes.
There's been a lot of things discussed, both in the scientific community and also in the mainstream media, about ultra processed foods and the issues and the health issues, and then going back to COVID and the susceptibility to more extreme COVID for people with metabolic disease. And the thing about those foods is so frequently they have significant large multinationals behind them and quite powerful advertising budgets that are pushing you know, them out there to the people. How there's antagonism there between the health and obviously the profits of these companies. How does that fit into decision making? And I guess even if we could dig in a bit deeper, sort of policy sides of things that governments could potentially put in place to improve the health outcomes of people.
Yeah, so on a personal level, a lot of it is just trying to change your life so that you're exposed to fewer ads, to fewer things. If you know that it's a particular drive home from work passes by, 16 takeaway joints, then think about a different way home. Try and watch TV where you're watching Netflix or something. That gotta sound like Netflix, but at least they don't have advertisements. So if we can avoid some of these things, that can help. I mean, on a broader level, I mean, there's all sorts of issues around the gut micro organisms and so on around ultra processed foods that kind of is a bit outside of what I do, but that in itself, because there can be elements of addiction and elements that are much harder to deal with. On a policy level, it's a really quite interesting one, because I'm sitting here in Australia where we do have quite strong policies around things. I was out at a show last night in a suburb of Perth, and it's the whole town centre is smoke free. So the town council has actually, it's not just, Australia is very highly regulated around smoking, but I was in Switzerland only a few months ago, and you can still smoke in restaurants. I mean, it absolutely shocked me that there's these differences in policies and regulations. So policy does work, but you have to have a populace who's willing to accept it. And there are certain countries that just are not willing to have those policies brought in. So that becomes a real tension then.
And I guess that moves on to the individual behaviours, and then you've got societal behaviours and the aspects that drive change there. And obviously societies are the sum of all the individuals. But how can you unpack that a bit for us, how they fit together and the nuances there?
Yeah, I mean, at a starting point as an individual, if you want to change behavior, it's often about having a buddy, having somebody in your life that's willing to change with you. So, we get a lot of people who want to change their behavior, but kids or husbands or wives don't want to change their behavior. So it becomes very challenging. Think about something like smoking in particular. If you're around other smokers, it's often much, much harder than when you're away from smokers. So at an individual level, if policies aren't changing, if populations aren't changing, then you have to make those changes yourself to try and avoid those situations. And that can be incredibly challenging. And that's where policy or attitude change can be really helpful. So if there are, increasing movements, it happened with smoking. So, there's still smokers in the world, but the majority of people now accept that passive smoking is bad, that, we shouldn't be smoking around other people. If we choose to do it, then that's up to us. So that has been a change in the past number of years, and it's a combination of legislation, of attitude change, of policy change. So it does all work together and can lead to sustained behavior change. And what we need to be doing around some of our foods and our exercise habits is working on what worked for smoking, and seeing if we can sort of bring some of that into the arena of healthy diet and understanding. And I mean, that we have to remember that, if you take something like smoking or eating chocolate away from people, we do have to give them something in between, because often that's the only thing keeping us from banging our head against the wall repeatedly. So, one of the things we spend a lot of time doing is trying to find out, well, what is the reward you're getting from it? Is it stress relief? Is it actually the hedonic feeling of the cigarette or of the chocolate? Or is it just that time it's 10 minutes by myself and I'm not having to deal with anybody else? So unpicking that can help people then determine what works for them on an individual and on a policy level.
If we look at smoking as an example of a success story, I guess that means we have to look at the timelines and the costs and have realistic expectations in terms of how long these things take. I remember, television, anti-smoking television campaigns back in the 1980s, which is 40 plus years ago. And it's only, even in places like Switzerland and places like France as well, there's still, and also the global South, there's a lot of people who still smoke. So even though there's been successes, is there a way of speeding up that process of change, or is that just, we just need to understand that that's how long it takes, and that it's going to cost similar amounts of money and time and resources, and we have to plan and have expectations around that?
I mean, I think as you say, when with multinationals as powerful as they are, and already even with smoking, we're starting to see an increase in vaping. So, a battle that health policy people had thought was nearly won in certain countries is now actually going backwards. So, while we have companies that are as rich as they are versus public health systems in countries that are very poorly resourced, then I think, yes, it's always going to be challenging. And that's why we do need to be doing it at both ends, at the policy end and at the individual end, because individuals can change their behavior even when societies don't. So people can make those choices, but it's often our more vulnerable people who are less likely to change. So with smoking, it's often our poorer people in society, it's people with mental health problems, and it's the same with food. So we definitely do need to try and make changes, but often the changes need to be aimed at a different part of the society that's actually the ones who tend to benefit most from public health campaigns.
Culture is something else that plays a huge role in what we eat. And it could be next week is Thanksgiving here in the United States. It could be having your mates around for a barbie. It could be Eid across the Islamic world, where part of the process is to slaughter a sheep. How important is culture, and how does that fit into the equation?
It's hugely important, and I think it's one of the universalities, if you like, around food and eating, is that no matter what culture, it's a part of our celebrations, it's part of everything we do has some sort of element of food or drink, and often our sad occasions, so funerals and so on, often again related to food. So it's how we bring people together. And it becomes incredibly challenging. The amount of times people come to me and say, I'm going around to see family this weekend, and it doesn't matter what nationality it seems to be, but grandma wants you to eat something that you don't want to eat and will be horribly offended if you don't. So, it's funny how we often see these cultures different cultures as very different, and yet there's a universality to all of that sometimes, that is, food is a bringing together. And if we don't accept the giant portions of cake or dessert or whatever it might be, family members get terribly offended. So yeah, it's incredibly challenging. And that's just one of the things that we do have to try and help people see, that a celebration is one day. And if we can keep it to, Thanksgiving, if you eat healthy 364 days a week and blow out on Thanksgiving, it's not a problem. But the problem is we have a lot of celebrations, so it's then trying to negotiate all of those. But a one day where we have more than we probably should is not going to set us up for bad habits for life.
The way the world's going with climate change, with the environmental impacts of the food systems, there's another ever increasing angle in terms of the food discussion. It go back to the 80s conversations and smoking and everything. It was very much about what was healthy, what was unhealthy, and all that sort of stuff. Now you've got the fact that people are also adding that climate dimension and the sustainability dimension both into their choices, so that has potential guilt aspects, as well as there's different products or different offerings coming in there. How does that complicate the whole situation?
Again, it makes things incredibly difficult in terms of decision making. And of course, on top of all the sustainability stuff, we've got a cost of living crisis in a lot of countries at the moment. So, because of various wars and so on, and various other things that are happening globally, there's a lot of countries and a lot of people who were doing okay 12 months ago really struggling now. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment with the food bank here in Perth, and trying to look at, they've seen a huge change in their clientele just over that period since COVID. The people who are using food banks have changed dramatically. So you throw your cost of living crisis in with your sustainability, and it becomes incredibly challenging, because obviously more sustainable foods are the ones that are grown locally. And some countries are very lucky because they have that, but they're often dearer. So you've got then that challenge of, if you're working on a budget, you can't necessarily go for sustainable because you're having to go for cheap. You're having to go for, hopefully cheap and nutritious, but they don't even necessarily go together either. So it can cause terrible anxiety and stress among people. And it is one thing that I think on an individual level, if I'm talking to someone and they're on a budget, I would tell them to forget about sustainability for now, because, you know, that one individual, yes, we all should be trying to change, but, you know, there's enough guilt and stress and worry in the world without one individual thinking that their single action is going to be enough. Sustainability and global change has got to be happening, I think, at a much bigger level, like we were saying with, you know, with policy and so on. Yes, individuals can make a difference. Yes, we should all be trying to do this stuff. But if I was seeing somebody who was, you know, really worried about this, I would say choose, you know, keeping your family healthy and fed over saving the planet, and we'll worry about the planet tomorrow.
That all makes perfect sense, and very much from that individual perspective. And I think if you look at that scale of food affordability and the cost of living crisis, you know, the first thing might be to get rid of the more sustainable food. But then as you get further and further squeezed, and you're likely to be forced to buy cheaper food, frequently that is the processed stuff, the stuff that's going to be more likely to lead to metabolic diseases. So you've got this cost of living crisis, which is potentially creating, you know, these two time bombs, being the climate time bomb and the metabolic disease time bomb. And, you know, obviously individuals don't have the power, and the ones who have the least power are the ones who are most affected by this. But then that comes back to decision makers and governments, that they're aware that this crisis is just creating bigger problems down the track. Is there work that is going on, or what do you see in that space? Is that something that needs more attention, or are people focusing on that?
There's some work being done. I mean, there's some countries that have brought in nice labeling that, you know, help people to sort of make those decisions as to, you know, which foods are better or are not so good. And that often means that manufacturers then change their formulas so that they reduce the sugar content of certain foods, or they take out some of the processing that was going in. So changes like labeling can help companies actually change their behaviors. So until we have regulations, until we have stronger rules around what's in our food supply, it's very hard for governments to, you know, tell people to stop making the bread that's highly processed, because that's what people are going to be able to buy. And then, of course, once you've got used to having highly processed food, you develop a taste for it. So, you know, it becomes this very difficult cycle to break. But, you know, we do have some countries that are doing quite well at tackling some of this. You know, advertising to children, for example, is being tackled in a number of countries where, you know, you're not allowed to have all the pretty cereal packages with Disney characters and so on. And that then means that companies have to change what they're selling to children if they want to, you know, keep that market. So, you know, food companies can, I mean, their bottom line is to make money. They're not, I don't think, inherently evil. They're just doing their job. But, you know, it's up to sort of governments and policy to try and nudge them into doing the right thing, because of the, you know, profit will probably take over any health messages if companies can get away with it.
It's everything we've discussed. There's a lot of complexity with this. There's the science of it. There's how you fit that into a diet, and the average person doesn't necessarily have the time or the educational background to dig into that every time they go to a restaurant, or every time they go to the supermarket to buy their food. So how can we work better with people to help them make right decisions or better decisions, you know, given the complexity of these issues?
Yeah, and I mean, I think you're dead right. You know, to those of us who work in this space and spend a lot of time thinking about it, you know, we forget that it's not a priority. It's, you know, probably seventh or eighth on somebody's after their kids' education and their jobs and paying the mortgage and so on, and food and diet and health and so on is there, and it's important, but it's probably much further down the list. Even things like, you know, we do stuff around medication adherence and other types of you know, health behaviors, not just about diet, but often these things are not as important to other people because there's just so much else going on. So at an individual level, a lot of what we do is about trying to get people to move from decision making to habits. So, some people really quite like routines, and for those people, having Monday night is shepherd's pie, Tuesday night is meatloaf, Wednesday night is whatever, and that there's, you have cereal every day except Saturdays, and whatever it might be. But if you can take a lot of that decision making out, and have a routine, then that really can help people, because they don't have to think. They come home and they know what they're having. And most of us actually, even if we don't realize it, most of us have, even if we love cooking, we have a relatively small repertoire of regular meals. So we do tend to have about, 14 or 15 meals that we eat regularly. So that's easy then to put into a routine and make it sort of easier for people to say, I don't have to think about it. So you start off with planning and a lot of self-control and a lot of impulsivity management, but that moves on then if you do it often enough, and often enough can be a long time. People get told that habits take 14 days or some other nonsense like that. It takes closer to somewhere around 80 days for the average person to form a habitual behavior. But if you can get people doing that, and that's around exercise, it's around medication adherence, it's around diet, anything, habitual behaviors become much easier to maintain than things that we do less routinely.
In a previous conversation talking about I guess regenerative agriculture, one of the guy I was interviewing, a guy called Terry McCosker, said that the biggest factor stopping people making their farms much more sustainable was education. And it wasn't a matter of just doing a half-hour course here or a 1-hour course there. It was a matter of having a relationship between the educator and the person, as well as building the confidence with that person, that they have more confidence in their decision making. And it ended up being a 2 or 3 year process that he was discussing. And obviously, with the 8 billion of us on the planet who are all eating, there's just not the resources to put that much time and effort into everyone. But what could be done in that to help people? Because if you're saying it's taking 80 days to make a decision, and you say, okay, here's a leaflet, that's not going to last 80 days.
No, so that comes back then to what we talked about earlier. It's about motivation, first of all. So, one of my favorite sayings is education is not enough to change behavior. So it's the prerequisite. Without education, without knowledge, we can't change behavior, but it's not enough. Otherwise, none of us would do the things we do that we shouldn't. So you have to start with education. People have to know. And it's surprising actually how little people do know around things like healthy eating. We did a study a couple of years ago. This is one of my favorite anecdotes. And we took photos of what people were eating. People took photos of what they were eating and sent them to us. And then we had conversations in focus groups with people to say, what do you think of this meal? Do you think it's healthy, not healthy? What would you change about it? And so on. And one was a Sunday roast with meat and veg and roast potatoes and so on, and 8 bottles of beer, empty. And people were asked, what would you change about this? Not one person said reduce the alcohol consumption. People didn't seem to relate alcohol to calories. It was very much, have fewer roast potatoes, have less gravy, cut back on the size of the portion. But there's these empty bottles sitting there. So first of all, I think we do need, as you say, the education and element of it, because people have blind spots where they don't see it or they don't want to see it. Again, that's back to our cultures and our societies. I was at a wedding recently, and a guy went up to the bar and asked for an alcohol-free beer, but it came in a bottle, and he wanted it poured into a glass so that none of his friends would know that he was having alcohol-free beer. Now, that's a terrible, thing to say about our society, but it's the reality with a lot of people, particularly a lot around men's health. Men don't want to be the one who's having the salad or the one who's having the low calorie beer and so on. So there's definitely elements there where we need to be helping people to see that managing their health is good, and it's good for society, and it's good for individuals. And so that comes back to a lot of, as you say, the cultural and society side of things. So you've got your motivation, and then you've got your capability. Are people able to do it? So back to your, your sustainable agriculture. It's not just do I have the knowledge to do it, it's do I know how to, am I engaged enough in actually doing it, because it's often a lot of extra effort. And then opportunities. So how easy is it for people to make the lifestyle changes they want to make? So the easier we can make it, so, going back to the 80 days to form a habit, the easier we can make that for people. So it's not just giving a leaflets, but it's helping people change their environment, so that, the first thing you do when you walk into your house isn't see a giant box of chocolates sitting on the counter, you see a fruit bowl sitting there. So there's a lot of things people can do to make it easier for themselves. And then there's a lot of things as policymakers or, as researchers that we can do that will help people make those decisions.
Going back to your comment about, going around to your grandmother's house and being forced to eat, whatever was the delicacy or of the time when your grandmother was growing up, which we can all relate to. Today, we live a much different life in terms of engagement, like face-to-face engagement with people, using devices and technology rather than, and just less time. How does that change? It's kind of a silo or a bubble around yourself. You've got less interaction. How does that change, I guess, our behaviors and our willingness to change, or change our susceptibility to other influences?
I think if our family structures are getting smaller, or if the number of people we see are getting smaller, in some ways that can help us to avoid having to eat a whole cake every Sunday when you go around to visit your grandparents. But on the same time, if you think about the French slow food movement, and sort of our relationship with food, one of the difficulties with not having that sort of family engagement with food is that we are often eating on the trot. We're eating very quickly, we're grabbing food, and we're not giving it the attention. And then that lack of mindfulness then can lead to us overeating, because we don't actually stop and engage with the food. So, there's definitely advantages in not having big, huge family celebrations where we have to sort of, the table groans with the amount of food that's on it. But often we're losing a lot in our relationship with food, and we have to sort of rethink, if you think back to, sort of I can't remember this far back myself, but if you think back to the start of the late 70s, early 80s, when it was women's liberation and women didn't want to be cooking, and that was where there was a lot of these sort of ready-made meals started being made, and it was to sort of help women get out of the kitchen, and we still have a lot of that, and a lot of those cooking skills and so on have been lost. So we do have to sort of rethink what we teach kids, what we teach people around, and men and women, so that and non-binary, of course, but so that people can have a healthier relationship with food, where we see food as something to thoroughly enjoy and have, as part of with our loved ones and so on, but also to know that too much all the time is not necessarily good for us.
What gives you, out of all the work, all the studies that you have done and the people you speak to, what gives you hope?
I think most people, sometimes it's hard to feel this when we've got 2 world wars going on at the moment, but I think genuinely most people are good and want to help each other. So, we do a lot of work trying to help people to negotiate with family members and with loved ones to sort of support them on their journey towards, healthier behaviors. So the vast majority of people do want to help each other. And I really do believe that. And I think if people, when we do relate to some of these big multinational companies and so on, I do see hope there as well, because yes, of course, there's bad ones out there. But, we're doing work at the moment with a big, one of the big mining companies here. And, they're really keen to improve their policies around, safety of workers and health and so on. So there's definitely a lot of goodwill out there. And I think that, that keeps me going when some experiment doesn't work or some study doesn't have the results that I wanted it to have.
Thank you very much for everything you've shared with us. But before we go, is there anything that you think you should add that we haven't so far discussed?
Yeah, the only thing would be, I spoke a lot about people changing, and I think it's important for people to, not lose sight of, yes, all of this stuff is important, but be kind to each other and be kind to yourself. People, when they're trying to change their health behaviors, are violently cruel to themselves. They talk to themselves the way you would never talk to your friends. So, we're doing some work at the moment around self-compassion. I'm working with adolescents who have chronic diseases. And one of the things we spend a lot of time doing is trying to teach them to talk to themselves the way they talk to a friend. Because most of what we say inside our heads when we're failing at something or when something's not working is so cruel, and we would never talk to someone we love like that. So a little bit of self-compassion and love for ourselves on any journey to help, on any journey to help, will really help people manage any sort of, mental health consequences.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much for your time.
No worries. Cheers.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Barbara Mullan, recorded in California in November 2023.